Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 15th of March. Somehow, although this podcast has been running for just over 2 years, so that this is the third time the 17th of March has come round, I haven't had much about St. Patrick so far. In 2024 I had an excuse, because Patrick was pushed around by falling on a Sunday in Lent, and indeed for most people he just disappeared altogether. But last year I somehow still didn't say much about him, so I'll make up for it now. On Tuesday the 17th we celebrate St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. Patrick was born in Britain, probably in northwest Britain, probably at the end of the 4th century. There are a lot of probablys in Patrick's story, because the dying days of Roman Britain weren't exactly the best time for clear and accurate records to be written, or for them then to survive all the way through the Dark Ages. Anyway, Patrick was the son of a good family, the kind which took a responsible part in local affairs. His father was a senator of the city they lived in, and a deacon as well, and his grandfather was a priest. Patrick was in the process of being educated up in that tradition of public service when at the age of 15 some Irish pirates kidnapped him, took him to Ireland, and sold him as a slave to one of the local chieftains. He was a slave for 6 years before he escaped. I have known people to whom something like this has happened. They, whoever they may happen to be, knock at your door at 3 a.m. and say, "Come with us," and you say, "Where?" and they say, "Come with us." Your life has ended. Nothing will ever come back to normal again. The marks of that experience are lifelong. Someone who has been through that is different from other people in ways that can't be understood unless you know where the difference comes from. Funnily enough, it's not the obvious things that matter. Most people think of an interrupted education, first of all, but education can be caught up with later. What can't be caught up with is, basically, what would have happened to you if you had had a life between the ages of 15 and 21, because at 15 you are a child, and at 21 you are a young adult. Never mind the schoolwork. You have spent those years learning by experience and contact and osmosis what it means to be an adult in your particular society. You have been learning how your society functions, even that there is such a thing as society. If you're taken away at that time, that stuff can't be just learnt later from books. In this sense, Patrick was actually relatively lucky. His owner put him to look after his sheep. Patrick thus had a defined place in a defined society. Admittedly, the society was Irish society, not British, but it was a society, and the place he had in it was the lowest place, but it was a place. And he learned the Irish language, one of the most annoyingly complicated languages that Europe has ever had, and, by the end of it, he knew through and through how the Irish thought and how their society worked. Without his knowing it, God was preparing him for something. You can even make quite a good argument for the sheep. Saul herded his father's donkeys before he was anointed king of Israel. David was a shepherd boy. The Mongols, who conquered most of Eurasia over and over again, wandered across the steppe with their herds. Perhaps one of the things about shepherding is the time it gives you for contemplation. Your teachers are the clouds and the sun and the green hills. Nothing distracts you from contemplating them, and through them getting close to God who made them. At last, after 6 years, Patrick escaped from his slavery and took ship to Britain. Most people, having been through all that, long to be home, even if it has to be a new home, because that is what world history has decided. Home is a place, and their attachment to that place ends up so strong that anyone who doesn't know why can easily see it as irrational. But Patrick didn't do this. Perhaps his long days of contemplation had taught him that God too is a place, and that wherever God is, that would be Patrick's home. And God, of course, is everywhere. It's worth remembering what the times were historically that Patrick was living through. The Western Roman Empire was getting feebler and feebler. People talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, but it was slower than that. Perhaps you might call it a deflation. Whatever you call it, on the 24th of August 410, when Patrick was a young man, Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome, the first time the city had fallen to an enemy in 800 years. In that same year, the last of the Roman troops left Britain. On the 4th of September 476, when Patrick was an old man, the final Roman emperor, a boy of 16, went into honoured and respected retirement, and the rather unstable Gothic kingdom of Italy began. But while the Roman Empire was fading out, a new force was bursting into flower. Christianity might have been going for 300 or 400 years, but it had only been legalized in 313, less than 100 years before Patrick was born, and the final persecution under the Emperor Julian was so recent that many people must still have been alive who remembered it happening. So now, for the first time, Christians had to think not of small, frightened groups hiding away from their persecutors, not of Christian communities embedded in a pagan world, but of an actual Christian world. Without knowing it, they had to design a whole new society that would be Christian and also, this is the bit they didn't know, sow seeds that would survive the dark age of barbarism that was coming. That's when we get the great founders and innovators in Roman Gaul. In successive generations there were St. Hilary of Poitiers, St. Martin of Tours, and St. Germanus of Auxerre. Patrick, on his escape from slavery, went to the monastery which had been founded by St. Martin and spent years studying there. Then he went on to St. Germanus and worked under him, and finally in the 430s the Pope sent Patrick to Ireland on a mission to convert the country to the faith. The religion of pagan Ireland was Druidism. The Druids were an organised body, part religious, part magical, who wielded great authority, sometimes more than the kings did. We haven't got a proper continuous history of all this, but a simple summary is that Patrick did what he could where he could, and as the grace of God spread, what he could became more and more, and where he could spread until in the end it covered the whole country. The stories we are told of confrontations with the organised Druids remind me of Elijah versus the priests of Baal, except that the conversion of Ireland seems to have been accomplished without martyrdom or bloodshed. Actually, my favourite Patrick story comes right at the beginning of all this. One of the first things Patrick did on landing in Ireland was to go to visit the master whose slave he had been, so that he could pay the man compensation for the slave he had lost. We think nowadays of Ireland as being rather on the edge of the civilized world, a nice, quiet, mostly agricultural country with plenty of rain, and to the west of it there's nothing except the ocean. But for a couple of 100 years in the Dark Ages, Christian Ireland was not the periphery but the centre. Europe did collapse into darkness in the end under the weight of the pagan invasions. Huge territories were lost to Christ. But among all that, Christian Ireland shone out as a lamp of learning, religion, and culture. People from all over the continent came to Ireland to learn and study and be safe, and they were welcomed there. When the moment came when it was possible to re-evangelize the lost territories of Europe, it was from Ireland that the first missionaries came. We have very little written about Patrick during his life, and very little written by him. But just as Patrick's career is a demonstration of the sheer power of God, so St. Patrick's most famous work is a poem invoking that power. It is called St. Patrick's Breastplate, and here is a modern version of it. I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one and one in three. I bind this day to me forever by power of faith Christ's incarnation, his baptism in Jordan River, his death on cross for my salvation, his bursting from the spiced tomb, his riding up the heavenly way, his coming at the day of doom, I bind unto myself today. I bind unto myself today the virtues of the starlit heaven, the glorious sun's life-giving ray, the whiteness of the moon at even, the flashing of the lightning free, the whirling wind's tempestuous shocks, the stable earth, the deep salt sea, around the old eternal rocks. I bind unto myself today the power of God to hold and lead, his eye to watch, his might to stay, his ear to hearken to my need, the wisdom of my God to teach, his hand to guide, his shield to ward, the word of God to give me speech, his heavenly host to be my guard. Against the demon snares of sin, the vice that gives temptation force, the natural lusts that war within, the hostile men that mar my course, or few or many, far or nigh, in every place and in all hours, against their fierce hostility I bind to me these holy powers. Against all Satan's spells and wiles, against false words of heresy, against the knowledge that defiles, against the heart's idolatry, against the wizard's evil craft, against the death wound and the burning, the choking wave, the poisoned shaft, protect me, Christ, till my returning. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. I bind unto myself the name, the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one and one in three, by whom all nature hath creation, eternal Father, Spirit, Word. Praise to the Lord of my salvation. Salvation is of Christ the Lord. Too often we think of us Christians as being meek and unthreatening, and you might even say nice. But we are part of Christ, and Christ is God the Son. And God the Son made the world, not just the nice peaceful bits either. In being Christians, we are in a direct relationship with the power that didn't only make the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. He made the quasars too, and the galaxies and the supernovas. Once you realize that, you begin to feel what the Bible means when it talks about the fear of God. Once you realize that, it's a wonder that we don't get frazzled into smouldering cinders by all that power, but by the mercy of God we don't. Still, the fact that we don't doesn't mean that the power isn't there. St. Patrick's breastplate is an invocation of God in power. That is what our life is, underneath all the meekness and niceness. The power protects us. The power is in us. What if we woke up one day and the power came alive in us? What then? It is Lent, therefore the subject is sin. Last weekend I talked about the only healthy attitude to the sins we commit. It has two parts. First, we have to take responsibility and say, I did it. The second part is to say that the I who did this thing is not the real I. I did it, yes, but I didn't do it. This attitude is healthy and it is even cheerful, but to make it cheerful, actually to make it possible, there is one more thing we need. We need the prospect of healing. We need the prospect of separating the unreal I, which can and does do bad things, from the real I, which is made in God's image, what Julian of Norwich calls a godly will that never assented to sin, nor ever shall. As Catholics, we have this possibility. Just as if you wake up one day with a wart dangling off the end of your chin, it happened once to someone I knew, You go to the doctor and he separates this ugly thing from you, because even though it is made out of your flesh and is nourished by your own blood, it is not really you. So in the same way, you look clear-eyed at your thoughts and your actions, and you see them clearly as the real you and the not you. Seeing the difference clearly, with God's grace you go to confession, and in the confessional Jesus Christ, sitting on the other side of the grill, heals you. Christ the doctor, who is always happy to heal you, if only you let him. Half the trouble people in this world have with right and wrong comes from not believing sinners can be healed. If you can't believe in healing, it is intolerable to believe in a disease. But that's only the first half of the trouble, and today I want to talk about the second half, which is the question, what is a sin? Now, there are forms of religion in which sin is simply defined as something that's been put on a list by someone. Some of the old-fashioned patriarchal Protestant religions of the Scottish borders are said to have been like that. I suppose you could say it's logical. Tough landscape, tough climate, tough life, tough people, tough religion. Those religions said that you live your life doing what God has commanded and not doing what God has forbidden, and at the end of it all you are rewarded or punished. Rewarded or punished for what? Not for good or evil. Good and evil never came into the story at all. Obedience to God's commands was the only virtue. If God had happened to say, "Thou shalt steal," these people would have had to spend their lives stealing their neighbour's cattle, or be damned. Now, this kind of religion is not so much nonsense as non-sense. It is not sense. It does not have making sense as a concept at all. And yet the great commandment, quoted so many times in the Gospels, says we must love the Lord our God with all our mind, which is to say, treat God as if he made sense, which is to say also, or else it couldn't be a commandment, God does make sense. In the Creed in Slow Motion, I talked a lot about this in the context of the Creed. Nothing about the faith that is true because it is in the Creed. But everything in the Creed is in the Creed because it is true. Loving God with the mind means looking at the truths in the Creed and seeing the sense they make, seeing why they are true. Exactly the same exercise can be done with the moral life. We can think about what is right and wrong just as we can think about what is true. And just as thinking about what is true gives us what you might call an instinct for truth, so thinking about what is right and wrong will give us an instinct for right and wrong, for good and evil, because right and wrong are meant to be understood, not to be looked up in a list provided by some high authority. Lent is a good time for this. The more able we are to think morally, the less stressful the whole thing will be, and the more fruitful it will be. The more able we will become to be ourselves, living fully, living freely, without our nose forever in an instruction book. I want to give just one example. We have all heard of the 7 deadly sins. They are only one way of organizing some of the ways in which a human being can go wrong, and quite often they may not even be the best one, but they are probably the best known. I want to ask a very simple question. What makes the 7 deadly sins bad? What is bad about pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust? It can't just be because God decided to put them on a list. These things must be sins because they actually are bad. The one commandment that matters is the commandment to love. Therefore, the 7 deadly sins must be enemies of love. Therefore, if we could see how that was true, we could look up our instruction books rather less and turn our attention directly to love instead, loving rightly and living freely. Dante has been there before us. His poem, The Divine Comedy, is one of the masterpieces of world literature. He wrote it between 1307 and 1321. It is an adventure story. It is a study in psychology or in theology. It is a speculation about life after death. It is a celebration of modern science and a pioneering work of science fiction. It is the first European work of fiction to be set in the Southern Hemisphere. it is a vision, above all it is a poem. It's all these things at once. At the beginning, Dante comes to himself in a dark wood. He has lost his way, literally in the story. Metaphorically, too, Dante, the character in the poem, is a man halfway through life and a man who has lost his way. To find it, to find himself, he has to journey down through hell to the very bottom of it, to climb the mountain of purgatory up to the earthly paradise, and then travel through all the spheres of the heavens until he comes outside space and time and for one timeless instant contemplates the source of all being, which is God. Definitely do read it, but I want to pick out just one feature. Purgatory is my favourite part of the poem because hell is despair and horror and heaven is above me. Purgatory is full of people who have chosen God over themselves already and now only need to be healed of their sinful tendencies, so it speaks to every one of us. Dante, being medieval, is in love with logic and order and reason, and his purgatory has a clear and definite structure built around the 7 deadly sins. Thus, simply to make the poem work, Dante has to answer 7 times the question, what makes a sin a sin? Here is how he does it. Pride comes at the very bottom, because it is, in a sense, the root of all the sins. It is a sin of love perverted, love twisted round so it points the wrong way. Deep down at the foundation of pride, you are putting yourself in the centre of the universe instead of God. Envy comes next. Envy is also a sin of love perverted, of love twisted. You should love your neighbour as yourself, so that his joy is your joy and his sadness is your sadness. But you twist that round. You are happy when your neighbour is sad, or you're sad because your neighbour is happy. Anger is also a sin of love perverted. With envy, your neighbour's happiness made you unhappy, but with anger, you actually want to do him harm. That said, remember that not every feeling of anger is a sin. In fact, feelings on their own are probably never sins. What makes anger a sin is that you go from a feeling to an actual act. The act may be a real happening in the real world, or it may just be you actively thinking about the harm you would love to do. The key is the will gets involved. That gives us a little reminder that all sin is not about feelings, but about the action of the will. Sloth is a sin of love defective. You know what you should do, you are right about that. As far as that is concerned, you would be a brilliant lover if you did it. You just don't do it. Avarice is a sin of love excessive. God made the things of this world so they are in themselves good and worthy of love. Avarice is an excessive love of these things, a disproportionate love. Like the other sins, it twists you out of shape. Gluttony is another love of something that is good, of all the things that are good for the body. Food and drink, probably massages and spa treatments as well. The body is good, so the things that are good for it are good too. After all, without a certain love of food and drink, you'd be dead. But if your love for these things is out of proportion, then so are you. Lust comes last in the list, as Dante uses it, and that is interesting because it makes it the highest of the deadly sins, the nearest one to heaven. And so it is. At last we do have an actual love for other people, and love is what the whole universe is about. We may be loving the right things excessively or disproportionately, or in a way that can lead only to harm, but at least we are loving them. The Sunday Gospel this week is another of the great Sunday Gospels that define Lent, and I'm sure you will hear all about it at Mass. So let me put in a word for another blind man's story which the liturgists disrespect so much that you won't hear it until a weekday sometime in February 2028. The liturgists are wrong. The story is the very short one of Jesus healing the blind man at Bethsaida, and what I find so absolutely right about that Gospel, when thinking about sin, is that Jesus doesn't heal the man all at once. The first time he lays his hands on him, the blind man sees, but as if through a fog. I see people, but they look like trees walking. Jesus lays his hand on the man's eyes a second time, and only then does he see clearly. Some of us, at some time in our lives, through our fault or through circumstances or a combination of the two, find ourselves in a way of life which is intrinsically bad and we can't see the badness of it. This could be a protective blindness in that the truth is too terrible to contemplate. Until you have a way out, knowing just how bad things are could break you and destroy you. So what God does is this. He gives you a dim idea that where you are is not where you should be, and you need to get out. It is a dim sight through a fog, just like the blind man's trees walking. Later, when with your limited sight and God's guidance you are out of that situation, whatever it happens to have been, he heals you a final, definitive time, like the blind man's second healing, and you see it all clear and sharp. The great thing about God the Son is that he has been one of us and he knows how weak we are. When sharp sight would be too dreadful, he gives us dim sight to guide us in our escape. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.